welcome to Working Your Way, the podcast dedicated to exploring the journey of authenticity in the workplace and discovering how to navigate it your way. I'm your host, Sandhya Sudhakar. Now, this podcast, Working Your Way, is all about how we can show up more authentically in our careers. And while authenticity is a great thing, the whole point of that is so that we can achieve the things that we want to achieve in our career, but do them in a way that actually feels good, without all the stress and the struggle and the suffering that can sometimes come along with building a successful career. So authenticity allows us to have that success at work in a way that's far more sustainable and actually takes into account our own well-being, our energy, and just how we close out each day in a way that we can keep doing it for a long period of time. So one thing that I've talked about a lot on this podcast, though, is that you cannot have people showing up authentically to an environment that is not welcoming that actually doesn't foster and encourage that authenticity. And so these two episodes that I'm doing today and the one last week are really focusing on that. They're about creating that environment that celebrates the authenticity of our people that we show up with into the workplace and really leveraging it to create amazing results. So I'll talk about this next topic, psychological safety, as one way that you can help your people work their way. Now, last episode 70, we talked about how to build a more inclusive culture on your team by knowing your people better and by keeping 3 big things in mind. 1, how are you leveraging your people's talents? 2, how are you interacting as a team and with your individual employees to ensure that different work styles have the opportunity to contribute fully, that people can leverage their best ways of thinking and bring their best to the table. And 3 is really how to tap into what drives your people so you can know how to manage them and also know what to avoid to not demotivate them. So if you're interested in that, go back and listen to episode 70. It'll give you more context for what you're about to hear. So for today, part 2 of this series, we're going to talk about how to create the conditions for psychological safety, meaning what can you do as a leader to enable your people to feel psychologically safe at work so that they can bring their best ideas to the table, so they can challenge things or push back when they see things that might result in issues down the road. If you haven't checked out episode 70, like I said, go back and listen to that. I ended that episode with an example of when I worked with a team leader to kind of improve their culture. And a lot of it was about building safety for the team. So that's a really good example there of how the team dynamics came together to create safety. So as we're talking about psychological safety, I mentioned it last time, it's quite a big buzzword in the industry now, and I think there is some misunderstanding about it. So let's define it and talk about what it really is. So a lot of the research behind the concept can be credited to Amy Edmondson, who is a researcher and a professor, and her work got incorporated into one of the most referenced studies ever, maybe, on what makes an effective team. It was called Project Aristotle. It was funded by Google, and Project Aristotle defined psychological safety as the belief that team members can express themselves freely without fear of negative consequences. Now, this study found that psychological safety is the single most important factor in what makes an effective team. Every effective team they studied had psychological safety as the foundation of everything else that they did. And so psychological safety means your people feel safe to take risks, to speak up, to disagree openly with each other and with you, to surface concerns, to ask for help, to admit mistakes, to suggest new ideas. And when you create it on your team, or when you create the conditions to allow it to thrive, it improves engagement, it improves motivation, it improves innovation, and it improves inclusion. And so people feel like their contributions matter, They're more likely to offer new and innovative ideas. They're more likely to voice their opinions, and they're more likely to be themselves, which again is that key to not burning ourselves out and not struggling and suffering through achieving big results. So just a really quick note on how inclusion and psychological safety are related. So inclusion is really about ensuring that individuals, regardless of their background or their identity or their experience, feel welcomed and valued and empowered to participate in the group. It's about recognizing and appreciating the differences and welcoming those in, right? Really leveraging those. Psychological safety is the assurance that sharing thoughts and perspectives won't result in negative consequences, even if maybe those contributions are unconventional or they're vulnerable or somebody makes a mistake and shares that. So I think psychological safety is really necessary for true inclusion. And we're not talking about this kind of feel good, we all get along kind of inclusion, but really true, I can show up fully here and not have to be scared of saying the wrong thing kind of inclusion. So it's important to note, though, that like belonging, this is a felt experience for each individual. So as a leader, you can't single-handedly create psychological safety for every person on your team, but you can do a lot to create the conditions that will enable people to feel it. On that point, though, I will say psychological safety also, this is kind of one of those ways it's getting maybe misused or misunderstood. Psychological safety doesn't mean that everyone feels amazing all the time and it's always unicorns and rainbows. And I think that's unfortunately kind of one of those ways the idea is getting misinterpreted. Like, I want to feel totally comfortable at work all the time. And that's really not psychological safety. In fact, real, true psychological safety sometimes mean that people are saying things that make others or themselves feel uncomfortable. It's about saying the hard things. And we're not causing harm in the process of doing that, or we're not fearing that there might be negative consequences on us if we do those things. And so I think where this intersection of inclusion and psychological safety exists is I feel valued here, and I can trust that I can bring up ideas or challenges, and I know that my doing that is respected and valued. So I'm not going to spend as much time talking about ways to create psychological safety as I am talking about what gets in the way. You know, there's a ton of information on the internet that can give you advice. You can Google how to create psychological safety as a leader. I'm going to link an article that I wrote to the show notes here too that will help with that. But a few quick points on what you can do as a leader before we kind of get into what gets in the way. One of the biggest ones is, how do you model vulnerability and humility? If we're asking people to share their mistakes or push back or say something hard, a leader is going to first have to really role model that vulnerability, admitting their own mistakes or asking people for feedback and being willing to receive and hear what they're not doing well, or even showing up and talking about how they don't have all the answers. It really creates this kind of growth mindset, or on a collective level, like a learning culture. The second one, as a kind of quick point of what you can do, is encourage and actively listen to differing perspectives. So inviting all the voices to the table, this is a big part of inclusion, and listening without interrupting, without judging, acknowledging and validating different points of view, especially when it comes from folks that are quieter, which we're going to talk about a little bit later in this episode. But really asking for differing perspectives and listening and like showing that you actually value those things. The third one is normalize asking questions and challenging the status quo. So you as a leader, again, a lot of these things are, you are the leader of the team, meaning you go first. You ask the tough question. You challenge the status quo. You share your mistake or your failure And it will pave the path for other people to do that too. And that is such a big part of creating psychological safety, of building that environment, of setting the right conditions so that people feel safe to show up and do it also. So creating this culture where curiosity is encouraged, where dissenting opinions are welcome, making it clear that questioning ideas is about improvement. It's not about criticism, and showing up and not meeting it with defensiveness as a leader when it does happen. Fourth is recognize and appreciate contributions. So publicly acknowledge and celebrate the ideas and the efforts of your people. That helps reinforce, like when they bring their ideas forward, you're recognizing, you're celebrating their contributions. When they're adding their ideas and taking risks, that you're actually showing that that makes an impact. And then fifth is creating kind of clear team norms and boundaries. So set and reinforce norms that are respectful, that help include everybody's perspective when you're making decisions, that setting this tone of calling out when something that happens that is maybe exclusive, when someone says something harmful or offensive, like making sure that those things are addressed. And so embedding this kind of idea into all of your team practices, into your norms, into how you run meetings and all of that kind of stuff. So let's talk a little bit about what gets in the way of psychological safety and what we can do about it. I always find it easier to provide examples when we're saying what might be a barrier and how can you overcome that barrier. So I'm going to talk about these ideas through the lens of Enneagram types. And if you're not familiar with the Enneagram, it's a personality framework, but really more so it's a tool for emotional intelligence development where each person identifies strongly with one of 9 core archetypes, and you can use it to build your self-awareness, to understand your talents, to learn better relational skills, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There are a million things you can do with this tool. I have a couple episodes about it. I think it's 20 and 21 if you want to learn more about the basics of the framework and also how to use it for emotional intelligence work, both for yourself as a leader and also for your team. But each type is rooted in a specific set of kind of internal motivations and coping behaviors that develop in really early childhood. And using this information, I'm always able to more easily identify the fears or avoidances of different types of people. And so for this next part, you don't need to know anything about the types. Just tune that part out if you're not familiar with the types or not interested in learning about it. But you can listen for the insight of how people operate, and maybe it will spark some familiar experiences for you that you've had with people that work with you or work for you. So as we talk through these, I'm going to talk about the 4 levels of psychological safety, right? So we talked about psychological safety being this sense of safety that you can say the wrong thing, you can make a mistake, you can fail, you can bring an idea to the table that maybe seems a little wacky or out there, or take that risk, and you're not going to have these negative consequences. And so there are really 4 stages of it, and they build on each other. This work is by Dr. Timothy Clark. He's got a book on this, but really psychological safety is kind of, there's 4 progressive stages that individuals and teams go through to build this kind of fully safe and inclusive environment. So the first stage of psychological safety is inclusion safety. So this is the foundational level where people feel accepted and included, and they feel like members of the team, regardless of the differences in their identity or background or beliefs. They feel safe to be themselves without rejection or fear of exclusion. So this is obviously really important because, hey, we're humans. Everybody has this need to belong. Everybody has a need to be validated and accepted and feel understood. And so people are more likely to engage and contribute to the team when they have this foundation of inclusion safety. And so as an example, some things that might get in the way that are kind of maybe a little more of these internal blocks that you can create an environment that you think is psychologically safe, but people may still not feel that way. A couple of types in the Enneagram that you might want to pay special attention to are the type 4. So a type 4 is called the individualist. They often have this kind of fear of being misunderstood. They often feel really different from other people. They value authenticity and self-expression. And so they can have a tendency to feel excluded if they don't feel like their uniqueness is seen and appreciated. And so if it's an environment where everybody has to operate the same way or do the same things the same way, they may not feel like they can express their individuality. And so they may have a challenge with feeling that sense of inclusion safety, even if you feel like you're creating an inclusive environment. So for that, it's really, how do you connect with people? How do you make them feel seen? How do you get to know them? It's really about building that connection that can kind of overcome that challenge. The type 9 I also want to talk about. So type 9s are called the peacemaker. Sometimes they're called the diplomat, but they are one of the types that might have the most challenge just asserting themselves, expressing their opinions, or even really feeling like their opinions and ideas matter or like they're worth even bringing up. And so type 9s really value harmony. And so they have a tendency to maybe downplay their needs or their ideas. They can be really conflict avoidant. And so, having them practice voicing their ideas, giving them space and time, maybe not putting them on the spot, but sharing with them like, hey, I really want you to share something about yourself in today's meeting, or we're going to be brainstorming around XYZ subject or initiative. And so I want you to think about, give them a little advance notice or give them some prep time so that they can kind of be ready to share their ideas. I talked about getting to know people, but that's a really big part of like building this inclusion safety or setting the conditions for people to feel it is make sure you have time to get to know people, build connection. And that can be social connection, but it can also be like an opening to a meeting and like sharing something, having a question that is something that's a little reflective that will get people talking. Also, doing inclusion training is kind of like the barrier or cost of entry here, right? It's like table stakes, whatever all those colloquialisms are. Doing inclusion training to ensure that people understand biases, they understand microaggressions, they have some kind of basis of cultural competence, they might recognize where they can cause harm to people. That is especially critical because once you do damage in this area, it is much harder to recover. And so making sure that your whole team or whole organization like at least has a working knowledge of like what it looks like to work on your biases, to understand what you like can say that will offend people or cause them harm. The other thing about inclusion safety, I would say that is important is like getting to know people can happen in a lot of different ways. So if you're a leader and you don't have one-on-ones with your direct reports, like 100%, that is something you should do. It's the most basic thing you can do to build connection and trust with your people. And that enables so much else to happen. So getting to know people one-on-one, having that together time and working through discussing, knowing what they need, asking them what they need, and then also taking that time in team meetings to get to know each other. Okay, so the second level or stage of psychological safety after people feel like I can show up here and be myself is this idea of learner safety, learner safety. And at this level, this is where people feel safe to ask questions, to make mistakes, to admit they don't know something without that fear of kind of embarrassment or punishment or some kind of negative retribution. Encouraging kind of curiosity and experimentation, encouraging people to admit when they don't know everything. Again, one of the best things you can do here as a leader is lead with that. Do that first. Show where you don't know everything. And that can be a really, really valuable way to set the tone and role model the behavior. Learning is important. Clearly, we need to train on new things. We need to learn new skills. And so making sure that not knowing everything doesn't come across as a negative thing. A couple of examples just for the Enneagram types. Type 1. So Enneagram type 1 is called the reformer. They're sometimes called the perfectionist, but they have a fear of not being perfect. They really try to avoid making mistakes. They try to avoid doing things wrong or incorrectly. And a lot of the effort that they put out into the world and the energy they put out into the world is to avoid being criticized. And so, in an environment where you want to build learner safety on your team, a person coming into that environment with a fear of making a mistake or being criticized or doing something the wrong way provides a little unique challenge for you. And so that's the type 1, really thinking about how you can make it safe for that person to do those things, to make those mistakes, to admit they don't know something, or even to have done something wrong and share it with you. The type 3 is known as the achiever or the performer. They don't like to do anything that might damage their image. So image management is a big part of what they do. And so appearing to know things and have it all together can be something that a 3 might do. They may have a reluctance to admit that they have gaps in their knowledge or that they've made a mistake, or this fear of failure is a huge part of what it means to be a type 3, is like avoiding failure at all costs because it might damage your image, it might damage your success. Embracing that kind of like growth mindset might be a little bit harder for them. And then the last example I give before we'll give a couple of suggestions on this is the type 8. So type 8s are the challenger. They're really strong, they're powerful, and they really may be hesitant to admit that they don't know something. It might make them feel vulnerable. They at all costs avoid vulnerability and weakness. And type 8s typically don't take things very personally. They're not going to be like worried as much about what people think about them, but they would be worried if admitting that they don't know something or they don't have the answers might make them vulnerable or appear vulnerable or weak. And so there's definitely potential for that there in this stage where that may be a barrier to them feeling that sense of learner safety. So what I mentioned before, as a leader, the best thing you can do is set the tone. Share something. What is something that you don't know? Share a story about a mistake that you made that was really embarrassing. Going first and kind of putting your own vulnerability out there does wonders for others being able to do that same thing. Now, for the type 3s and the type 1s that kind of have this fear of failure, fear of making mistakes, find ways to share failures and harvest learnings as a team. Like, you can incorporate this into your culture. How can we talk about what we didn't do well? How can we talk about what we tried and didn't work? And how can we get the learnings out of that? Really embracing this kind of learning culture. There are companies even that have these like FailCon where they every year will like have people tell failure stories. And so normalizing failure and reframing it as learning, encouraging experimentation really helps people that might have that kind of natural inherent resistance to making a mistake or failing, might make them feel more comfortable and really be able to make that reframe. The next thing that I would say from a learner safety standpoint is make sure that you're checking in with people and providing support. Again, I'll say it again, I will say it a million times. One-on-ones with your people are absolutely critical. If you're not having them, you absolutely need to be doing that. Now, maybe it's not every week, maybe it's every other week or once a month, depending on the level of dependency that they have on you for getting their work done. But in a one-on-one, you can ask people like, what is something that you're struggling with? You can share something you're struggling with. So use these check-ins as times to understand like where someone's struggling, where they might make a mistake that could have bad business repercussions, that they just don't want to admit that they don't know something. And of course, obviously, like if they do make those mistakes, like again, finding ways to normalize it and make it okay to share. It's always better to have the information, whether it's after the fact or before the fact. And so really like starting to create that culture of trust that like, yes, I can be that person that you can share that with. I will help support you through it if it's something that you're struggling with, but really giving them that forum. A lot of times with leaders, I ask people to start asking, like typically in coaching, you're asking open-ended questions. But when you know something is a challenge for someone, if you ask them a closed-ended question that doesn't allow them an out, like a type 2, what can I take off your plate? Or what do you need to deprioritize? Instead of saying like, Are you overwhelmed right now? Like, how are things going? Or are you doing fine? They'll say yes. But if you say, what can we deprioritize on your work plan? They have to come up with an answer, right? So, same thing for what are you struggling with? If someone has to come up with an answer and someone who might normally be resistant to share that they're even struggling, it doesn't give them an out and they have to answer something. So keep that in mind as you kind of maybe learn some of these specific barriers for your people. Okay, so the third level or the third stage of psychological safety is contributor safety. And so we've talked about inclusion safety. Do I feel like I can show up here and be myself? We talked about learner safety. Do I feel like I can learn, like I can experiment, like I can make mistakes, like I can admit that I don't know everything? This third level is contributor safety. This level allows people to contribute their skills, their ideas, their expertise without fear of maybe ridicule or even being ignored. And so this is an especially important one to think about. If someone is contributing ideas and they're not being validated or recognized as just even an idea or a contribution, it's going to discourage people from continuing to do that. So encouraging that and validating that helps people really participate actively and confidently. And so contributor safety really maximizes the team's collective knowledge and intelligence and problem solving abilities, because when everybody is sharing their ideas, when everyone's putting in their expertise, you're going to get the best end products. So empowering people to do that and encouraging people to do that is really important. So a couple types that might have a natural resistance to contributing: the type 2, the helper, the giver. They can have a fear of rejection or a fear of feeling unappreciated if their contributions aren't acknowledged. And so this is one where specifically, if you've got type 2s or type 3s that are sharing ideas, like recognizing them and seeing them, type 4s also for that matter, recognizing them and seeing them for those contributions, even if it's not something you're going to action or act on, it's important just to kind of acknowledge and affirm that. And so type 2s might hesitate to share ideas if they feel like they're not valued or needed. And so encouraging that by really recognizing that when it does happen is really important. And then with the type 5, so Enneagram type 5 is called the investigator. They are the systems thinkers, the data gatherers, the data analyzers of the Enneagram, and they might have a reluctance to contribute if they feel like they don't have enough information to have a good answer, or if they feel like they have too much kind of insecurity or uncertainty around their idea. And so type 5s really value having that expertise, and they really fear and avoid being seen as like incompetent or unprepared. And so reinforcing that evolving ideas are valuable, that really sparks collaboration. When you throw out something that might be half baked, that it's okay and someone else can build on it, like reinforcing that and having, time and space for it's okay to bring a partial idea. It's okay to bring something forward without knowing fully how to solve it. And really encouraging that can help someone like that, like a type 5, kind of get over that hump of not wanting to contribute because they don't feel like they know it well enough. So a couple of other things just for contributor safety to really help foster this is, especially for those folks that think my ideas aren't good enough, or my ideas aren't right, or they don't matter, or they're not appreciated, starting brainstorming with like validation, the affirmation of like when people are bringing those things to the table, just recognize it, acknowledge it, like appreciate it. But then if people might be worried about they don't have enough expertise or they're going to share a bad idea or something like that, maybe starting brainstorming with each person has to share the worst idea they can think of, like just to kind of grease the skids, get something out there, to just have a good laugh as a team too. That can be a bonding experience. And so little tactical things like that can really help with this. Also, to encourage everybody to contribute, thinking about creating systems where There's like equal airtime in the room for everybody, that like the loudest, fastest talker in the room isn't always getting all of the airtime or all of the attention for their ideas. Because when that happens, the folks that are going to be more withdrawn are not going to bring their ideas to the table. They're not going to say anything. They're going to kind of sit there. And creating some systems in your meetings for equal contribution or equal airtime. Maybe that's as simple as a round robin and having everybody be able to share, or giving people a minute or 2 minutes or 3 minutes to jot down ideas on a piece of paper before everybody starts shouting them out. Like that can also really help. They're really simple things that can help build more equitable contributions in a meeting. Another is allowing people to prep in a way that works for them. So if you know you've got these kind of more thorough processors that need more information, need more time or space to process, how can you maybe publish some information in advance, or like properly prep people before meetings to know what's going to happen in that meeting and what they should come ready with? And then last, I think I said this 14 times, but I'm going to say it again, recognizing people's contributions, and specifically doing it in a way that they like to be recognized. So a lot of times you might on your team have certain awards or shout outs or things like that. And some people really might love that and get a lot of fuel out of that. And some people might not. And that actually can be demotivating. So really understanding, how do you want your contributions acknowledged? How do you want to be recognized for each of your people is a great way to understand how do you encourage their contributions, because you're recognizing them in a way that works for that person, the individual. Again, this is a place where we have a tendency to like just assume that people want what we want. Like, I love to get an award. I was always all about that in the corporate world. When I was in that chapter of my career, I'm like, put me on stage and give me an award. Like that would drive me for a year. Like it would fuel me. But a lot of people don't want that. And so I just, may have never asked the question. I've been like, of course, everybody wants this award. I want that award. And so if my person, one of my people earns it, I would give it to them and they would go up on stage and they might have hated that experience. So really understanding how people like their contributions acknowledged is a great first step. Okay, so the fourth and final stage of psychological safety that we're going to be talking about here is something called challenger safety. So at the highest level, this means that you've created this level of psychological safety where team members feel safe to challenge the status quo. They have a safety in questioning decisions and providing candid feedback without fear, giving you feedback. And so challenge safety is really critical for innovation, for problem solving. It's important to encourage constructive dissent and to debate things. And all of that leads to better decision making. It leads to better ideas, more innovative ideas, and it ensures that teams don't become complacent or stuck or like doing the same old thing that becomes outdated. So a couple types that might have a little bit of a challenge here: challenging decisions or challenging the status quo. Like a type 3 we talked about, they do care a lot about their image. And so if challenging someone's decision might risk their status or advancement in some way, like that may be something that they would really hesitate to do. And so that is more of a systemic issue of like, if someone's going to bring something up and challenge a decision, they're not getting promoted. That's a bigger issue that I think probably might be out of your control or something that you can try to solve. But type 3s just really want to be successful and they want people to think highly of them. And so challenging in that way can maybe feel a little bit threatening to that. Similarly, but slightly different, a type 6 called the loyalist, called the skeptic, they can fear like questioning authority sometimes. They do have oftentimes like a deference to authority. They want guidance and support and reassurance from authority. And so challenging authority can be particularly hard for a type 6. Also, they have this sense of loyalty. And so if they were to challenge something that someone's doing that might feel like they're not being loyal to that person, that might cause them to kind of like have a lot of resistance to feeling this challenge or safety. Also important to note, like type 7s and type 9s are the most conflict avoidant generally of the Enneagram types. And so if we are challenging someone's ideas, challenging the status quo, challenging a leader, providing an opinion or an idea that is like going against the leader, you as a manager or someone above you, like that is going to be particularly challenging for a type 7 and a type 9. They avoid conflict. Type 9s avoid discomfort and confrontation. It creates chaos inside of them. It goes against this idea of like kind of having harmony in their environment. And type 7s avoid conflict because they just generally avoid negative feelings. They avoid feeling like they're disappointing someone or letting them down. And so they often just don't bring things up. So a couple of things that I would suggest here to kind of really build the conditions that enable challenger safety is helping people be uncomfortable, getting comfortable with being uncomfortable. And there's a couple of ways to do this. Actually, Lovey Ajayi Jones has a great TED Talk on this. So that can be a resource, but also just giving people resources to develop their emotional intelligence, to say, like, have somebody recognize that they have a conflict avoidance and this is why it happens and here's how they can overcome it. And so emotional intelligence work is going to pay off in spades, whether it's bringing in a coach or a facilitator like me or just having some kind of tool that you use or some kind of class online or any kind of resource is going to have business benefits for you because people will be able to build their self-awareness, they'll be able to communicate better, and that's always going to help. Couple of other things you could do to kind of create those conditions for people to feel this highest level of psychological safety, the challenger safety, developing a language or some team norms around saying uncomfortable things. So one of my friends had joined a team and they had just gone through a training called Radical Candor. It's a book, but there's also a training that goes along with it. And they had this language that they would use where they wanted to say something uncomfortable and they would say, in the spirit of radical candor, blah, blah, blah. And so it gave them an in. It's almost just like a code word to say, hey, I'm going to say something uncomfortable right now. And having that language, having a team norm around that or a practice or that language around that can actually really help people just overcome that discomfort because it's like everybody understands here that this is uncomfortable and that I mean it with the best of intent. There's also like, when people say, I'm going to, let's put the elephant on the table, like even just little fun team things, like you have a plastic elephant that you have at meetings. And like, if someone's going to say something and put the elephant on the table and they actually like literally go take the plastic elephant and they put it in the middle of the table and it kind of eases the tension and the discomfort around those types of things. And so getting that difficult information out of people, finding some language or like a little team practice or a norm or something around it can actually be super helpful. The other thing that I would say is like with challenger safety, especially when it comes to people giving feedback to you as a leader, as leaders, we build trust over time. As humans, we build trust over time, right? And it's through repeated experience of somebody and seeing, like knowing how they're going to respond based on the evidence that you've gathered. So we build trust over time through our experience of people. So what you can do as a leader is work on yourself, work on your self-regulation skills, work on how you can manage your own emotions in a way that's healthy, work on how you can be more consistent. How can you take better care of yourself? How can you make sure you're getting good sleep and all of those things so that you can show up at your best every day? Consistency is the number one thing that is going to build trust for a leader with their people is like, are you showing up not the same every day, but are you showing up in situations in a way that feels predictable for your people? Because that is safety. I know how you're going to react to this thing. If I tell you that I didn't agree with how you handled something in a meeting, have I done that before? And do I know how it's going to go? And I feel safe to know how it's going to go this time. And I recently just had a guest on the podcast, the episode's coming out in a couple of weeks actually, that actually just shared with her team when she would come into the office and like was having a really rough morning. Like she proactively share that so that they knew, like, hey, if you're going to have a tough conversation, like maybe in the next 2 hours isn't the time to do it. And so I think it's also really important to just be transparent with what is going on. You don't have to share everything that's going on with your life, but like being transparent about if you have a day where you're not able to be consistent, right? You're not able to show up at your best, that you're able to kind of like just communicate that to people so that they know what to expect. And then last but not least, in terms of challenge or safety, again, recognize this behavior, applaud it, celebrate it, reward it. Find ways to affirm that it is okay and actually wanted to challenge the status quo, to bring up dissenting opinions, to offer feedback to somebody in a way that is constructive and is in the best interest of the business and the team and the relationships. Those were the 4 levels of safety. Some of the personality types that might have particular challenges with achieving that level of safety for reasons that might not be your fault as a leader, but there are things in each of those that we talked about that you can do to kind of help overcome that or create better conditions for each of those stages. And I want you to think about, as a leader, where might you have some blind spots in this? Where do you struggle with feeling psychological safety? Are there certain stages that you have particular challenges with? Where do you struggle with creating psychological safety for people? What is hard for you to do? Is it hard for you to admit your own failures and therefore it's hard for you to kind of lead in that area and be vulnerable in that area? And is there something you can do to kind of overcome that resistance? Or can you create a system around it? I think the biggest thing is when there are things that we don't do naturally well as humans, and we all have many of those things, how can we compensate for those things by creating some team rituals or some team systems or some norms? And so I am an Enneagram type 3. I really don't like failing, and I certainly don't like failing in front of an audience. But if I know that about myself, I can actually create a little icebreaker in our monthly team meetings to say everyone is going to share, or like 1 or 2 people are going to share a failure that they've had in the last month and share what they learned from it. So I can create a mechanism to compensate for the things I'm not naturally probably going to be inclined to do. If you're a type 8, as an example, you might struggle with showing vulnerability and weakness. And so you better believe that, like, if you're resistant to showing vulnerability and weakness, that your people aren't going to feel safe doing that around you. And so how can you incorporate maybe some more storytelling into your leadership style, sharing more about yourself and figuring out ways that still feel safe for you to be more vulnerable, but making sure that you're being very proactive about doing that thing so that they pick up the message from you and feel safe to also be vulnerable or show weakness or admit when they've made a mistake. So if you want some help exploring this, definitely reach out. My contact information is in every episode show notes. This is what I do most often with teams, working both kind of this hybrid method of both working one-on-one with people and then also like with the team as a whole, doing workshops, doing individual coaching sessions or typing sessions or things like that. And really just helping leaders with helping their people to identify what are the issues and barriers and solutions that you can build in to build psychological safety and a more inclusive culture so that you can bring out the best in your people, deliver great results as a team without everybody burning out. So a couple of resources that I will share. I'll share the Enneagram episodes. I wrote an article about psychological safety and how to create it as a leader for a company that was a client of mine at one point, Flower Hire. We'll link that article. And then there's a podcast episode that is a panel that I was on about psychological safety, myself and other people that are far more qualified than I to speak about this topic. So you can listen to that and think about these 4 levels of psychological safety and where you are with your team, where you have blind spots as a leader, and then where you might have some natural resistance from the individuals on your team and what you could do to get around that. All right. Thank you for listening. I hope you have some really actionable things to do. Please reach out. Let me know what resonated for you in this episode and in the last one. And if you need any help with your team, you know where to find me.